June 26, 1948. 15:20 hours. Tempelhof Airport, American Sector, West Berlin. 12-year-old Traute Greer stood on the rubble pile that had once been her family's apartment building, watching the sky with the automatic wariness that 4 years of Allied bombing had instilled in every Berliner. The sound of approaching aircraft engines made her stomach clench with remembered terror. Even 3 years after the war's end, the sound of planes meant danger in the reflexive calculations of a child who'd grown up running to bomb shelters. But these planes were different. They weren't the high-altitude formations that had rained destruction on Berlin during the war. They were flying lower, slower, and instead of continuing over the city to drop bombs, they were descending toward Tempelhof's runways in steady procession. One after another, every few minutes, massive transport aircraft touching down, unloading, and taking off again in mechanical rhythm. Traute had heard the rumors spreading through her neighborhood that the Americans were bringing food by air, that the blockade the Soviets had imposed 3 days earlier wouldn't starve West Berlin after all, that the same nation that had bombed the city was now trying to save it. She hadn't believed the rumors. Nothing in her experience suggested that former enemies brought salvation. But as she watched a C-54 Skymaster taxi to a halt and ground crews begin unloading sacks of flour onto waiting trucks, she realized the impossible rumors were true. The Americans, the same Americans whose bombers had destroyed her home, killed her father, reduced Berlin to rubble, were bringing food instead of bombs. Traute began crying, not from sadness, but from the psychological whiplash of having every assumption about the world overturned in a single moment. The planes that had meant death now meant life. The enemies who'd destroyed Berlin were now trying to save it. Nothing made sense except the overwhelming relief that she and her mother and little brother might not starve after all. An American GI working the cargo detail noticed the crying girl on the rubble pile. He walked over, pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket, and tossed it up to her with a smile. "For you, kid," he said in English she didn't understand, but the gesture needed no translation. Traute caught the chocolate and stared at it like it was a religious artifact. Chocolate. Real chocolate. Not the synthetic substitute that had been all Berlin had seen for years. From an American soldier. At an airport where American planes were landing with food instead of bombs. The world had turned upside down, and somehow that inversion meant survival instead of death. For 2 million Berliners trapped in the western sectors of their city by Soviet blockade, the transformation of American aircraft from instruments of destruction to vehicles of salvation created a psychological revolution as profound as any military victory. They'd been enemies. Now they were supplicants dependent on their former enemy's mercy. And that mercy, incredibly, impossibly, was being delivered on a scale that defied comprehension. An entire city fed from the air by the nation that had bombed it into submission just 3 years earlier. The blockade that changed everything. The Berlin Blockade that began on June 24, 1948, represented Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin's calculated gamble to force Western allies out of Berlin through starvation rather than military action. The political and strategic context made the blockade seem like brilliant coercive strategy that Western powers couldn't effectively counter. The geographic and logistical realities appeared to favor Soviet success. West Berlin population requiring supply. Approximately 2.2 million civilians. Western Allied garrison personnel. Approximately 30,000 troops. Daily food requirements. Approximately 1,500 tons. Pre-blockade supply methods. 75% by rail, 15% by road, 10% by canal. All now blocked. Remaining supply route, 3 20-mile-wide air corridors from West Germany. Soviet expectation, Western powers would evacuate within 2 to 4 weeks. The blockade's timing was calculated to maximize pressure. It began in summer when heating coal wasn't immediately critical, but would become essential once winter arrived. Stalin's strategy assumed Western powers would face impossible choice: abandon Berlin and lose credibility, or attempt airlift that would inevitably fail once weather worsened and coal requirements increased. The strategic assumptions seemed sound. No city of Berlin's size had ever been supplied entirely by air. The logistical requirements exceeded any previous airlift operation by orders of magnitude. Winter weather would make sustained flights impossible. The Soviets controlled all ground approaches and could simply wait while West Berlin starved into submission. But the assumptions overlooked two critical factors: American industrial and logistical capacity that could be mobilized for peacetime humanitarian purposes, and the psychological impact on Berliners of experiencing mercy from former enemies while experiencing coercion from supposed liberators. The decision to defy. The American and British decision to supply West Berlin entirely by air represented extraordinary gamble that defied conventional wisdom about what was logistically possible. Military planners initially estimated that supplying Berlin by air was theoretically feasible, but practically unsustainable. They could deliver some supplies for weeks or months, but couldn't maintain the effort through winter or achieve tonnages necessary for population survival. General Lucius D. Clay, American military governor in Germany, made the fundamental decision to attempt the impossible. His cable to Washington on June 25, 1948, framed the choice starkly. "We have lost Czechoslovakia. Norway is threatened. We retreat from Berlin. When Berlin falls, Western Germany will be next. If we mean to hold Europe against communism, we must not budge." The decision wasn't just strategic. It was psychological warfare that would be fought through logistics rather than violence. Instead of military confrontation that could trigger World War III, the Western Allies would demonstrate that democratic industrial capacity could overcome communist coercion through sheer organizational competence and sustained effort. The operational planning began immediately. Every available transport aircraft in American and British inventories would be dedicated to Berlin's supply. Flight schedules would maximize aircraft utilization through rapid turnaround times. Ground crews would work 24-hour shifts. Pilots would fly multiple sorties daily. The entire operation would function as industrial process rather than military campaign. The first flights. The initial flights of Operation Vittles, the American code name for the airlift, began within 48 hours of the blockade's imposition. The first aircraft were whatever transports could be immediately diverted: C-47s from European-based units, C-54s from American air freight commands, hastily reassigned crews flying aircraft that had been scheduled for entirely different purposes. The early flights delivered minimal tonnage, but maximum psychological impact. Berliners who'd expected starvation and Western abandonment instead witnessed American and British aircraft arriving with food. The symbolic reversal was immediate and profound. Enemy bombers transformed into savior transports. Traute Greer's mother, Emma, described her reaction to the first supply flights in a diary entry from June 27, 1948. "Yesterday we thought we would starve. Today, American planes are bringing flour. The same Americans who bombed us. I cannot make sense of this. My husband died in their raids. Our home was destroyed by their bombs. Now they bring bread to keep us alive. I should hate them. Instead, I am grateful. The world makes no sense, but perhaps that doesn't matter if the senselessness keeps my children fed." The early tonnage was grossly inadequate, 800 tons daily when 5,000 were needed. But the psychological effect on Berliners and the political effect on Soviet strategy exceeded any military victory. The Western Allies were demonstrating commitment to Berlin's defense without firing a shot. The Soviets, who'd expected quick capitulation, faced unexpected resistance from an opponent who'd found a way to counter-blockade without military confrontation: the Candy Bomber. Within the industrial machinery of the airlift, individual acts of humanity created emotional connections that transcended strategic calculations. Lieutenant Gail Halverson, a C-54 pilot from Utah, initiated what would become the most famous aspect of the entire operation: dropping candy attached to handkerchief parachutes for Berlin children gathering near airfields. Halverson's innovation began informally. He'd give his candy ration to children at the airport fence, and they were so grateful for such small treats that he wanted to do more. He began dropping candy from his aircraft as he approached landing, using handkerchiefs as improvised parachutes. Other pilots saw the children's reactions and joined the practice. Soon, American families were sending candy specifically for Berlin children, and what had been one pilot's impulse became organized Operation Little Vittles. The candy drops carried symbolic significance that exceeded their material value. Berlin children who'd hidden from American bombers during the war now ran toward American aircraft, hoping for chocolate. The transformation from terror to trust, from enemy to benefactor, happened through the simplest gesture: sharing sweets with children. Mercedes Wilde, who was 7 years old during the airlift, remembered Halverson's candy drops decades later. We would hear the engines and run to where we thought the candy would fall. The parachutes were tiny, just handkerchiefs with 2 sticks of gum or a few pieces of candy, but they represented something bigger. They meant Americans saw us as children who deserved treats, not as enemies who deserved punishment. When I caught a parachute, I felt like someone across the ocean cared whether I was happy. That feeling stayed with me for life. The psychological impact extended beyond the children who received candy. Parents watching American pilots dropping treats for their children experienced cognitive dissonance that challenged every assumption about former enemies. The nation that had firebombed their city was now bringing food and candy. The pilots who'd delivered destruction were now delivering hope. The civilian response. For Berliners living through the blockade and airlift, the experience created profound psychological transformation in their attitudes toward Americans and their understanding of political systems. The contrast between Soviet coercion and Western assistance couldn't have been more stark or more personally meaningful. The daily experience of depending on American and British flights for survival created intimate connection to the airlift's success. Berliners could hear aircraft overhead constantly. The sound that had meant terror during war now meant security during blockade. When weather grounded flights or accidents reduced deliveries, anxiety spread through the city. When flights increased or records were set, relief was palpable. Civilians participated in the airlift's success through collective sacrifice. Berliners accepted reduced rations, conserved fuel, endured hardships, and maintained morale because they understood the alternative was Soviet control. The shared suffering created solidarity between Berliners and their former enemies who were working to keep them free and fed. The political transformation was equally dramatic. West Berlin, which had been Nazi stronghold during war, became bastion of pro-Western sentiment during the airlift. American flags appeared in windows. Children learned English phrases to thank pilots. The city that had fought against America during war now fought for the right to remain connected to American protection. The winter crisis. The true test of the airlift came with winter 1948-49, when weather conditions and increased coal requirements created the crisis Soviet planners had anticipated. Low ceilings, fog, ice, and storms made flying dangerous and reduced operational capacity just as heating coal became critical for survival. The winter months tested whether democratic systems could sustain commitment to humanitarian operation when costs increased and conditions worsened. Soviet strategy assumed Western resolve would break when winter made the airlift too difficult and too expensive to continue. The Western response was to increase rather than decrease effort. More aircraft were assigned, crews worked longer hours, ground personnel cleared ice from runways continuously. Pilots flew in conditions that would have been considered unsafe during peacetime. The commitment intensified precisely when Soviet strategy predicted it would collapse. Captain James Morrison, who flew C-54s throughout the winter, documented the conditions. We flew when commercial aviation would have been grounded. Low ceilings, poor visibility, ice on the wings, exhausted crews. But we kept flying because we knew Berliners would freeze without the coal we carried. Every flight felt like tempting fate. Several aircraft crashed. Some pilots died. But stopping wasn't an option. Not when children were depending on us for heating fuel. The breaking point. By spring 1949, the mathematics of the airlift had proved Soviet assumptions completely wrong. The operation that was supposed to fail within weeks had sustained 2.2 million people through winter and was achieving higher tonnages in spring than Soviet planners had thought possible at any time. The tonnage statistics told the story of systematic Soviet defeat. Total tonnage delivered by May 1949, approximately 1.8 million tons. Flights completed, approximately 200,000. Average daily tonnage, entire operation, approximately 5,000 tons. Peak daily tonnage, 12,141 tons on April 16, 1949. Cost to Western Allies, approximately $224,1948. Strategic result, complete blockade failure without military confrontation. On May 12, 1949, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade, acknowledging defeat without admitting failure. The roads, rails, and canals reopened. The airlift had succeeded in achieving what had seemed impossible, supplying a major city entirely by air for nearly a year, through winter, while maintaining civilian morale and demonstrating Western commitment to Berlin's freedom. The airlift continued officially until September 30, 1949, to build reserve supplies in case Soviets reimposed blockade. The final flights carried the same cargo as the first: food, coal, and hope for a city that had learned to trust the sound of American engines. The human cost. The success of the Berlin airlift came at a price measured in lives lost, injuries sustained, and years of service given by personnel who risked everything to feed strangers who'd been enemies years earlier. The casualties documented the operation's dangers. Allied personnel killed in airlift-related accidents. 101, approximately 40 British, 31 American, 13 German civilians on ground. Aircraft lost. 17 American planes, 8 British planes. Major accidents, approximately 120. Injuries, hundreds from accidents, exhaustion, and operational stress. The human cost included German civilians killed when aircraft crashed in populated areas, ground crew killed in loading accidents, and pilots who died in weather-related crashes. Each death represented individual tragedy and collective sacrifice for an operation whose success depended on willingness to accept risk for humanitarian purpose. First Lieutenant Robert Henderson, who died when his C-54 crashed on approach to Tempelhof in November 1948, left a letter to be delivered to his family if he died. The letter explained his commitment. "If something happens to me, I want you to know I'm here because I believe in what we're doing. We're feeding people who would starve without us. We're proving that freedom is worth defending without firing shots. If I die keeping Berlin free and fed, I'll have died doing something meaningful." The long memory. The airlift's conclusion didn't end the relationships it had created. American and British aircrews who'd flown supply missions received letters from Berlin families for years afterward. Christmas cards, birth announcements, wedding invitations from people they'd never met, but who wanted their airlift family to know about life's milestones. Some correspondence lasted decades, with American pilots watching German children grow up through photographs mailed across the Atlantic. The children who'd chased candy parachutes grew up to name their own children after American pilots they'd met, to emigrate to America in surprising numbers, to serve as translators and cultural bridges during continued American presence in Berlin. Mercedes Wilde, who'd caught Gail Halvorson's candy as a 7-year-old, became an English teacher who taught 3 generations of Berlin students. She kept one of Halvorson's original handkerchief parachutes, Priest. The airlift became advertisement for American reliability as ally. Perhaps most significantly, the airlift created psychological template in Soviet leadership about costs of challenging Western commitment to Berlin. When Khrushchev precipitated Berlin crisis of 1961 and eventually authorized construction of Berlin Wall, Soviet strategy carefully avoided repeating Stalin's blockade mistake. The wall divided the city, but didn't attempt to starve it. Soviet planners remembered that Americans had proved willing to sustain Berlin indefinitely, and that Western logistics could defeat Soviet coercion without firing shots. The closing legacy. On May 12, 1999, 50 years after the blockade's end, Trouta Greer, now Trouta Maxwell after emigrating to America and marrying an American veteran, returned to Berlin for anniversary celebrations. She brought with her the chocolate bar wrapper that American GI had tossed to her in June 1948, preserved in plastic for 5 decades. She'd carried it through her immigration to America, through her wedding, through raising 3 children who'd heard the story so many times they could recite it verbatim. Trouta gave the answer she'd refined over 50 years. I learned that the roar of engines can mean salvation instead of destruction. I learned that former enemies can become protectors. I learned that mercy is sometimes delivered in flour sacks and coal shipments and tiny candy parachutes. And I learned that the most powerful force in the world isn't bombs or armies. It's people choosing to help strangers who have no claim to their kindness. That's what America, yellowed and fragile, in a frame on her classroom wall, using it to teach students about the moment when former enemies became saviors. The strategic triumph. The airlift's success created unexpected strategic consequences that neither American planners nor Soviet strategists had fully anticipated. Within the Eastern Bloc, the operation became a dangerous example of Western capability that communist propaganda struggled to explain away. How could decadent democratic capitalism organize humanitarian operation on such scale? How could supposedly individualistic Americans sustain collective effort that matched or exceeded communist claims about collective action superiority? Soviet military analysts studied the airlift's logistics with professional admiration mixed with ideological discomfort. American and British forces had achieved what Soviet planning doctrine considered impossible: sustained air supply of major city through winter, using organizational efficiency rather than force or coercion. The technical lessons influenced Soviet military logistics development, even as political leaders publicly dismissed the operation as unsustainable Western desperation. More immediately, the airlift reshaped European recovery politics. Marshall Plan aid, which some Europeans had viewed skeptically as American economic imperialism, gained credibility through airlift's demonstration of American commitment to European welfare. If Americans would spend millions flying coal to Berlin, perhaps Marshall Plan promises about rebuilding Western Europe were genuine. Economic aid applications increased. Political resistance to American involvement taught Berlin. That's what changed everything. The planes disappeared into the darkening sky, their engine sounds fading to silence. But for the thousands of Berliners who'd survived because of those engines, the memory remained crystal clear. The day when American aircraft brought food instead of bombs, and the world learned that mercy could be measured in tons delivered, lives saved, and chocolate bars dropped from passing planes by men who chose compassion over revenge and sustained effort over strategic abandonment.